Hello, I'm Delora Washington, CEO of the CAYL Institute. For the past 20 years, the CAYL Institute board, staff, and fellows have been deeply committed to the vision that every child should have rights to a high-quality early childhood education. Our commitment is deeply grounded in the evidence of both the immediate and the long-term impact of early childhood education on children's success and well-being. Important progress has been made over the past 20 years, but nevertheless, as a nation, we have not wholly committed to the financial or program infrastructure that would support our youngest citizens or provide a living wage to the people who teach them. As a result, early childhood education in the United States is characterized by a fragmented patchwork of inadequately funded services that result in systemic inequities for children. It results in a passionate yet devalued workforce and communities that just cannot fully benefit from the knowledge base that we have developed of our own creation, and we can't even benefit from it. So in the next few months, the CAYL Institute will focus our attention on moonshots for young children, their teachers, and families. Moonshots are defined as monumental or lofty goals, and we want to shine a light on the need for a giant leap forward in our work with young children. In setting the agenda for these moonshots, we're inspired by the words of former President John F. Kennedy, who called the nation to action and achievement in the effort to go to the moon. With respect to the race to get to the moon, his 1961 statement said, "I believe that the nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out. No single project will be more exciting or more impressive or more important, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish." This is what President Kennedy said in 1961 about going to the moon, and we believe those same words equally apply to providing more quality education for our young children. The words and the sense of urgency behind them are exactly the commitment and the sentiment that is needed right now to care for the young children in our nation. In 1962, President Kennedy summed up the challenge of going to the moon when he said, "We choose to go to the moon in this decade and to do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard." Yes, it's hard, but it is so worth it. We must have a moonshot for young children, and the time to do that is right now. President Kennedy then just went on to ask the question, and he wanted to know from his staff, are we working 24 hours a day on this? And if not, why not? And I ask you with respect to improving the quality of life for our young children, are we working 24 hours a day on this? And why not? Why can't we do this for our children, our teachers, and our families? Why not? So the CAYL Institute proposes several moonshots for early childhood education. In our monthly webinar series, the first Thursday of every month, we're going to be stating a vision and stating our lofty goals. So in August, our moonshot is that every child should be included. And we're going to take a look at inclusive education. In September, our moonshot is that no child should be excluded. And we're going to take a look at practices that we can use to effectively ban preschool expulsions and help every child to be excel in his or her setting. In October and November, we're going to address moonshots for our early childhood education teachers. In October, the moonshot is that every early childhood job is an excellent job. And in November, we're going to talk about the moonshot of really retaining a highly talented workforce. And we're going to wrap up our moonshot series in December by envisioning that we are doing everything we can to honor every family. So in this 5-part series, teachers, researchers, and practitioners are going to join us as we boldly discuss next level policy and program innovations in our field. So don't miss this impactful CAYL Catalyst webinar series as we come together to envision moonshots for our children, for our teachers, for our families. And we are going to think together about timely, relevant, and immediately actionable solutions that can propel us toward this giant leap of progress for our children. We are the CAYL Institute, and we envision a nation where all children have the right to high quality early care and education, and that this right is embedded in public policy, in professional practice, and in family engagement. And we ask you to join us in this vision. We ask you to write in the chat right now, how are programs today successfully supporting and including all children, including those children with special needs? And we refer you to some of our resources that we have to support you as you address these important questions. But right now, it is my privilege to introduce to you our guest host today, who is Peggy Kemp, Dr. Peggy Kemp. She is the Executive Director of the Division for Early Childhood Education. She has decades of experience working for inclusion, and we are so honored that she is joining us here today.
Hello, everyone. First, I want to say thank you for Valora for the opportunity to guest host today. It is a privilege to speak to all of you. I love the idea of a moonshot, starting with the acknowledgement that each and every child belongs in our inclusive programs. And so today we will talk about some of the realities of what is going on in the United States and where our starting point is for that moonshot. Next slide, please. Couple of things to get our headspace in this general area. Inclusive education is not a privilege. It is a fundamental human right. It is a civil right, and everything that we do to move towards that is absolutely aligned with what we hold most dear in these United States. Next. Another quote that we've long held dear is, when inclusive education is fully embraced, we begin to realize the achievable goal of providing all children with an authentic sense of belonging. And that is really the heart of inclusion. If we think about all of the definitions we can find out there, the bottom line is, does the child and their family feel like they belong in their home, their community settings, their school settings? Next slide. To dig deeper into that, to help us all think about where to head this moonshot. Today, we will start with the introductions. In a moment, I will introduce our guests who are here to help us with that conversation. Allison, Friedman, Christy, Kavulic, and Hannah Gabretinsa. And then we'll do some group discussion and have a question and Q&A session. I think those of you who've joined us before know that after the formal presentation, we will have the opportunity to go on a different link and continue Q&A for those of you that want to expand our conversation. Let me tell you a little bit more first about our speakers today. Our first speaker will be Allison Friedman-Krauss, and Allison is joining us as Assistant Research Professor at the National Institute for Early Education Research. She leads the work on early childhood education policy research. I'm sure a number of us have seen some of the reports that she's been a part of. Her research is focused on our early care and education policy, on unpacking the impacts of early education programs and interventions, understanding quality care in early care and education, children's development within the context of early childhood education programs. So we're excited to have Hannah here today, Allison here today. Got ahead of myself. Hannah, and Hannah's helping me learn her name, but it's Gabretinsa. she'll help us with that. Hannah is the director of the Elliott Pearson Children's School, a laboratory and demonstration school at the Department of Child Study and Human Development at Tufts University. Hannah oversees and advances this university's local and global commitment to early childhood, both education, professional development, research about high quality services to children, both in the US and abroad. Hannah brings to us, to this conversation, extensive experience, including cultural competency, anti-bias and diversity training, curriculum and instruction, multi-language learner curriculums, educational policy, project planning, and much more. Hannah is one of the first CAYL fellows in early care and education policy in Massachusetts. Our third presenter is Christy Kavulic, and Christy is the Associate Division Director of the Early Childhood Team in the Office of Special Education Programs, or OSEP, in the U.S. Department of Education. In her position, she oversees the development and management of many discretionary grants that fund to support the programs under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, both the 0 to 3 or early intervention, and 3 to 5 or 619 preschool programs as well. Her programs help to prepare and maintain a highly effective early childhood workforce. So a lot of the things that we will talk about in this series, the work being done through Christy's division directly impacts that. Christy's team and she work with a lot of state and local level folks through their TA center work, implementing evidence-based practices, making sure our systems can speak with one another and work together as best that we can. Also collaborating with other federal partners outside of the OSEP team to make sure that our infants and toddlers and preschoolers with disabilities and their families have access to the high quality early childhood programs and services that are available to all children. So with that, we will move forward with this panel to really help us continue the conversation. Just a quick note, housekeeping, we are recording. You can access the recording after we are off. If you need closed captioning, please click the CC button at the bottom of your screen. We will have the Q&A session, as we discussed earlier, both immediately following this session and then a second opportunity with the link that you'll see at the end of the session. And we encourage you to write in the chat, as some of you already have started. Where are you from? And do you have any questions or comments? We will pull our Q&A both from the chat and from you and from our panelists. Next, please. So we'll move forward talking about our first moonshot, that every child is included, that every child is included, acknowledging that they may have different strengths, different possibilities ahead of them, and different abilities, both abilities that they find success in and that they may need different levels of support to achieve. Next, please. During this conversation, we'll talk about the realities that the field faces in achieving this moonshot. We'll talk about the fact that equity matters. Equity has always mattered. I think some of the issues of the last few years have brought it even more so to our attention. The realities of what happened after the COVID pandemic is something that Allison will talk to us about. And we're going to talk about the variations that we find within states and across states, which absolutely connect with the issue of equity and other equity issues around race and gender and other pieces that we will talk probably next time, especially as we talk about expulsion and suspension and things we can learn. Next slide, please. So with that, we are going to start with Allison Friedman-Krauss to walk us through the NIEER report that talks about early intervention and early childhood special education, and where we are at this time in our country. Allison.
Thank you, Peggy, and thank you, Valora, for inviting me to talk today about our new report. So as was mentioned, NIEER released a new report back in, I believe, May on it's called the States of Early Intervention and Early Childhood Special Education, looking at equity. It's the first state-by-state report on early intervention and early childhood special education that uses an equity lens, and it can be considered an equity audit for each state. The report was generously funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which also funded a similar report on early Head Start and Head Start that NIEER released earlier in December of last year, if anybody is interested in that as well. So the report includes a national overview as well as state-specific information on children's access to early intervention and early childhood special education, including what children of what characteristics are more or less likely to receive services, and where are those services received. Most of the data that we use in the report come from the IDEA data collections, as well as the state APRs, data that are all publicly available and that states are required to report to the federal government. The methodology section of the report does dig in deeper into the details of all the data sources. The report also focuses on the 2020-2021 school year. So a lot of the data come from the fall of 2020, which we know was greatly impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. So while the overall numbers and percentages that we see in the report are lower because of the pandemic than they would have been a year before, most of the patterns that we see in terms of the inequities that we find are really consistent. And for better or worse, we're not affected by the pandemic. And we also include a look back 15 years to show how the percentage of children receiving services has or has not changed since 2005. The report is organized around these 4 themes, which I'll go over today. The first is the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on access to services. The second is race and ethnicity. The third is gender. And the fourth is state-by-state variation, which also covers all these other topics as well as many others. Next slide, please. So to start, we looked at access to both early intervention in the green bars and early childhood special education in the orangish bars between the fall of 2005 and the fall of 2020. And over that time period, there was about a 1 percentage point, slightly more than a 1 percentage point gain, increase in the percentage of children receiving both early intervention and early childhood special education up until 2019. When we get to the fall of 2020, we erased almost all 15 years of progress in serving more children. We're back, not quite, but almost to where we were about 15 years ago. When I took a quick look, which is not included in this report, and the fall of 21 data, it suggests that the early intervention numbers have rebounded back to those pre-pandemic numbers, but the early childhood special education numbers may not be quite back up to where they were before the pandemic. We did see some differential impacts by race and ethnicity as well as where children were served. And so you could get more into that in the report, but I won't delve into that today, though happy to answer questions. Next slide. So the second theme in the report is access by race and ethnicity. So this is showing overall access to early intervention as well as access for children of different races. So overall, in the fall of 2020, 3.2% of children under the age of 3 received early intervention. But as you can see, this did vary by children's race. So white children were more likely than Asian children, Black children, and Hispanic Latino children to receive early intervention. And while some of these differences in terms of the sheer percentages were very small, they are statistically significant. So for example, we see that 2.8% of all Black children in the country under the age of 3 received early intervention compared to 3.4% of all white children in the country. So just to be clear, when we are looking at these percentages, I'm not saying that of the children receiving special early intervention, 2.8% were Black. We're saying of the Black children in the country, 2.8% of them were receiving early intervention. Next slide, please. So while I just showed you the overall national patterns of race and ethnicity differences in access, there is variation across those numbers and across those patterns by state. So what you see on this map is that in the dark blue states, a higher percentage of white children than Black children received early intervention, but in the light blue states, there was a higher percentage of Black children than white children. White infants and toddlers received early intervention. And the white states are those states that there was no statistically significant difference in the percentage between Black and white children in early intervention. Next slide, please. So now this slide is showing similar information, but it's comparing percentages of white children and Hispanic children. So white non-Hispanic children to Hispanic Latino children. There are more states that serve a higher percentage of white children than Hispanic children, but importantly, some states like California and Florida that have large Hispanic Latino populations do reach a higher percentage of Hispanic Latino infants and toddlers than white infants and toddlers. Next slide, please. So now we're turning over to look at access to early childhood special education. Very similar patterns to what we saw for early intervention. So nationally, white 3 and 4-year-olds are statistically significantly more likely than Asian, Black, and Hispanic Latino children to receive early childhood special education. For Hispanic, Latino, and Asian children, this pattern continues through school age. So they continue to be underrepresented as they transition into school age. But for Black children, the pattern shifts. So when you look at the school age data, Black children all of a sudden are more likely than white children to receive special education services. And so there's obviously something going on. We didn't really dig into the report, but that likely at a young age, Black children are missing out on opportunities to receive services that they may need from an earlier age. Next slide, please. So similar to early intervention, we do see state variation around the national patterns. So shown here, we're comparing the percentage of white children to the percentage of Black children receiving early childhood special education in each state, and the darker blue states like New York, Illinois, Mississippi, for example, serve a higher percentage of white children than Black children. And then the lighter blue states like Louisiana, Pennsylvania, California, Florida serve a higher percentage of Black children than white children in early childhood special education. And next slide, please. And so again, now looking at the comparisons for Hispanic, Latino children and white children, we see that there are 3 states, again, with large populations of Hispanic children, so California, Texas, and Florida, that are serving larger percentages of the Hispanic Latino children than white children, though the reverse pattern of serving a higher percentage of white children than Hispanic and Latino children is seen in more states. Next slide, please. So now we turn to the third theme of gender, and it's likely not surprising to most of you that we found large gender differences in access to both early intervention and early childhood special education, with boys being much more likely than girls to receive services. And this national pattern we really see in every state. So in every state, boys are more likely, a higher percentage of boys than girls are receiving early intervention and early childhood special education. This is certainly a topic for future research to understand why. We suspect that some of this difference is due to a true difference in need, but part of the difference may also be explained by over-identification of boys as well as under-identification of girls. Next slide, please. Now we're going to look a little bit more at state variation. So this map is for early intervention, and it shows the percent of children under age 3 receiving early intervention in each state. Darker colors indicate higher percentage of children receiving services. And so if you look at Massachusetts, they're the darkest blue on this map. They're the state that serves the highest percentage of infants and toddlers in early intervention. They're around 10% in 2020. Wyoming, New Mexico, and West Virginia are some other states that are towards the top of the pack. And then there's some other states in white that you see here that are closer to 2%, even less than 2% of infants and toddlers. And so while we don't really know what the right percentage is, what the real need is in every state for early intervention, it's unlikely that the true need varies by almost 9 percentage points across the states. Now, we did look at eligibility criteria for early intervention, like prematurity and low birth rate, and whether or not states allow for the use of at risk as an eligibility criteria. And that doesn't really explain the variation that we're seeing here. Next slide, please. And so now this map is showing the percentage of 3 and 4-year-olds in each state receiving early childhood special education services. We're using the same color scheme on this map and on the last map. So you'll see there's a lot darker here. So states are serving a higher percentage of 3 and 4-year-olds, but we still do see a lot of variation across the states. Again, with the darker colors showing higher percentages. Wyoming is the leader here, serving 14% of 3 and 4-year-olds. It's the only state serving more than 10% of 3-year-olds and 3 and 4-year-olds. At the low end, states like Texas and Florida reach less than 4%. And again, we're seeing this gap of over 10 percentage points across the states. Next slide, please. And so one of the things we tried to understand, why is there this variation across the states? And we really don't know. We didn't really get to the bottom of that. But one thing we found that explains some of the variability is state median income. So for both early intervention and early childhood special education, there was a strong positive relationship between the percentage of children receiving services and state median income. So in wealthier states, more children or a higher percentage of children were receiving services. This really jumps out as a clear source of inequity in access to early intervention, early childhood special education, which also seems against the federal requirements in IDA. We do see some states that stand out as exemplars for early intervention. For example, sorry, this slide isn't displaying exactly as intended, but it should have all the state names on here. So you could see the ones in the circle are New Mexico and Wyoming that are standing out as, actually, I think it's West Virginia, that stand out as two lower states with lower median incomes, but are doing a really good job of serving children. And why they can serve so many more children than the states that are sort of at the same income, like Florida, for example, we don't know. Next slide, please. And again, I apologize, the state name abbreviation should be on this slide as well. So this is just showing the same information for early childhood special education. And we see the regression line. Wealthier states are on average serving a higher percentage of children in early childhood special education. But there are standout states like New Mexico and Arkansas down towards the left-hand side. So that turns, oh, sorry, next slide, please, to our recommendations and conclusions from this report. So as researchers, of course, we're going to suggest more research as our first recommendation to really understand what is the true prevalence of need. It probably, again, doesn't vary by 10 percentage points across states, but it could. Does it vary as much as we see across race and ethnicity groups, across gender? What are like the ideal intensity and duration and quality of services needed to really support children? And some better data. We presented, we see this strong relationship between state income and access to services. What about individual child income and access to services? Are poorer children less likely to receive services? With the data available, we can't really answer that question, but it would be a good one to know. Similarly, are the children receiving special education services? Do they speak languages other than English? This would be helpful to both support them in their services, but also support communication with families, having a workforce that can better support the children as well. We touch upon cost data a little bit in the actual report. I didn't present on it today, but beyond the federal expenditure data, there's very little information available for each state, like how much are states spending, how much are local school districts spending on special education, and then what do they actually cost? So what's the difference between what high quality services should cost and what high quality services do cost? What's actually being spent? In our report, we recommended increased federal and state funding in line with Biden's proposed budget, which at that time seemed a little bit more promising than it does at this point. And finally, we really recommend a national commission or a national summit to bring states together. So one thing we found in the report is that a lot of states are doing things well, but most states aren't doing it all well. So states have lots of different things to learn from each other. So we could bring states to the table and talk to each other and to develop policy solutions and practice solutions together, we think could have a potential impact on reducing some of the inequities we saw in this report. Last slide. So there's a lot more in the report than I was able to get into today. So I invite you all to visit NIEER.org, and it's posted on our homepage. That's NIEER.org. There's information on access to services by single year of age, how states determine eligibility, federal funding, disability classification. So for example, in New Jersey, about 99% of children are in early childhood special education are classified as a developmental delay. And nationally, when you look at disability classification by race and ethnicity, you see a higher percentage of Hispanic children receiving classifications for language, which gets into the need for data on home language. There's data on where children receive their services, as well as how that was impacted by the pandemic. We do have suspension data, which suspension that's specific to children enrolled in public preschool, but so that might be interesting for your next conversation next month. Data on transition, outcome data for children, as well as some other indicators of inclusion that we take from other NIEER data in terms of the percent of children with IEPs in each state that are also enrolled in state-funded preschool or in Head Start. And with that, I will turn it over to Christy. And thank you.
Thank you, Allison. As noted, I work in the Office of Special Education Programs, or OSEP, within the U.S. Department of Education. And really, our work at OSEP is focused on improving results for infants and toddlers, children and youth with disabilities, ages birth through 21. And we do that through administering the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA programs that Allison was just sharing some data about. We provide grants to states to deliver comprehensive early intervention services for infants and toddlers. Sometimes you may have heard of this referred to as the Part C program within a state. And we also provide grants to states to administer special education and related services for children with disabilities, oftentimes referred to as Part B services. I thought it was really interesting, Allison, the results that Allison shared. As she noted, OSEP has different national data collections for early intervention and preschool special education programs. So, it's incredibly important to highlight this data to both understand the national picture of the early intervention and early childhood special education field, but to really look at the differences among populations of children served. And looking at the differences across states, it allows us then to examine how policies and practices may be impacting the number of children and their families who are served, as well as the type of young children and families served within a state or community. I think what Allison has highlighted really shows the disparities by race and ethnicity and who receive services under IDEA, and that where you live makes a difference in whether you can access IDEA services, which is just really a call that we must do better as a system and in addressing these issues. So, the intent of this series, the Moonshot, that we have a lofty goal and a goal we want to reach to make sure that all eligible infants and toddlers and preschoolers receive high quality services and supports as early as possible so that we can empower them to thrive and meet their and their families' individualized needs. So that's so important, because how we support and serve young children with disabilities and their families in their early years really sets the foundation for development and can really impact trajectory of learning as children move through school and even into the post-secondary years after school. I'd like to think that we're clear within OSEP that if we are to improve results for children with disabilities, that we must ensure from the earliest age that children with disabilities are valued members of our society, have the same access to learning opportunities as other children, and are held to high expectations. So in addition to focusing on children's and families' connection and access to services under the IDEA, we're also focusing on how and where these services are delivered. We believe that all young children with disabilities should have access to inclusive, high-quality early childhood programs that provide the individualized and appropriate supports so that they can fully participate alongside their peers without disabilities and meet high expectations in their learning and development. And, this means fully including young children regardless of the disability they have, the level of services or supports they need, as well as race and ethnicity, their language use, and any geographic and economic circumstances. And, we really want to support the inclusion of children because we know the benefits of including children with disabilities, both for children with disabilities and those without disabilities. There's been decades of research that have really shown that children with disabilities, when they're included, show greater gains in their cognitive skills and communication development. They demonstrate stronger social emotional skills than their peers that are served in separate settings or settings that are just for preschool children with disabilities, for example. And, studies indicate that children without disabilities show positive academic, developmental, social, and attitudinal outcomes from inclusive experiences. For example, they show greater compassion and empathy and have a more positive perception of disability. And yet, even though we know the benefits of inclusion and that we have strong laws like the IDEA that really support the inclusion of children with disabilities, we know that too many children are not getting access to childcare or other early childhood programs and often are receiving services separate outside of early childhood programs. And as kind of noted there by the report Allison has, that she wasn't quite able to get into all the areas, but if you look at some of the data they have and where children are receiving services, you can see disparities in race and ethnicity and also across states. So, if we're going to reach for the moon, as Dr. Washington introduced this session, that each and every young child with a disability will receive their services under the IDEA, and that they receive those services and support in inclusive settings, we're going to all need to work together as an early childhood community. This means working across early childhood systems and across programs and providers such as childcare, Head Start programs, other public preschools and private preschools, and schools and with healthcare providers, so that we can develop strong referral practices to IDEA and have early childhood programs that fully include children with disabilities. We also must engage families, faculty, administrators, and other community partners. Within OSUP, we try to support the inclusion of children with disabilities through different ways. We offer guidance and resource documents, as well as fund investments. I just wanted to highlight a few for you that you might find of interest. The Department of Ed and the Department of Health and Human Services did release a policy statement on including young children with disabilities in early childhood settings. And that was back in 2015. And we really feel that our vision of that all children with disabilities have access and can participate in early childhood programs, we need to reaffirm that. So we're currently working on updating this policy statement, and we hope to release that in the next few months. We also fund a number of investments, including technical assistance centers, such as the Early Childhood Technical Assistance Center and the National Center for Pyramid Model Innovations, which really have resources on how to support high quality inclusion within programs, as well as resources for at the different levels of the system. And just one other resource I want to mention is that we fund parent training and information centers, and theirs are within every state. And, I want to encourage you to partner with these programs so that you can effectively engage with families and, support families in understanding their rights under the IDEA. So we want to partner with you in really supporting children to be fully included. And so I hope you will not only use some of the resources and investments we fund, which I'll add in the chat, but that you can reach out to us when you have innovative ideas and practices. Thank you for your commitment to young children with disabilities and their families. And I'd like to turn it over to Hannah.
Good afternoon. My name is Hannah. There has been a brief introduction to who I am, so I'm going to kind of skip right into the presentation. I'm really excited to be here, and today I'm going to try to bring the voices of the field to the best that I can. The report and the discussions have addressed disparities in access to services reflected in the report, as well as in the work that we've done so far with key elements discussed, focusing on equity, race, ethnicity, gender, state variations, and the impact of the pandemic and so forth, which are very true to the field as well. A lot has been shared, so I want to reflect on them, highlighting some key points that need to be identified, valued, and acknowledged, and needing some attention mainly from the field, the ground, the practical world. And most importantly, why is this critical now? Not only to the children that we're serving, but also to everyone in the educational system and the nation overall. The challenges of children with special rights. I prefer to call children with special needs and children with disabilities as children with special rights, which is kind of adapted from radio, because it has special relevance to me. Because it gives the indication that all children have rights and are full of potential. They are competent in their own rights, full of life, powerful, and not missing things. Using the term rights over needs or disability emphasizes the special qualities each child brings. So I would like to highlight the challenge of the children with special rights, that it's not isolated, and it's not an isolated matter, neither should it our response be. The importance of understanding the meaning, benefits, needs, and implementation, and also the impact of inclusion and meeting the needs of children in our programs and educational systems is really important to everyone and impacts every single aspect of diversity and equity. The need and importance of systemic change in addressing early equity and cohesive services to all children and families cannot be addressed in isolation. So we need to reflect it in our practices, in our funding sources, in our research policy practice, and most importantly, build accountability to why and why not it's not equitable. So before I get into what I want to say, I just want to very quickly highlight, what do we mean by inclusion? Why should it be defined? How should it be defined? For inequalities to be addressed, diversity and inclusion should be at the heart of all efforts and belief practices, not just abilities. Inclusion is the building of a classroom and a school community and educational system that respects and supports all dimensions of human differences, including abilities, learning styles, ethnicity, culture, race, family makeup, socioeconomic structures, linguistic differences, and so forth. Integrating diverse children requires intentionality creating a community of culture and trust that supports a range of differences, and ability just fits right into it. Inclusive education is an educational practice based on the belief that all learners, with or without needs, have a right to be educated together and in developmentally appropriate groups that is beneficial to all. Each child is valued and accepted, strengths and needs are identified, children challenges are supported, foundation for success are instilled for them for life. And inclusive education is not about children. It's also about the fundamental important aspects of education, who are the teachers. So it is important that when we're thinking about supporting the system, we're thinking about who are the staff, how are we training them, how are they practicing reflective practice. All these items should be also included and thought through. Inclusive education is not only about children and educators, it is about the families. Because without the families, we cannot help the children alone in isolation. So our response to families, our listening, our support system, our resources is equally important in building this educational system. And most importantly, and not least but not least, is also the collaboration and integration across the early EI, early intervention, elementary and elementary secondary education, so forth, and school districts that offer a lot of the resources within their school systems and outside. So I think we really need to think about this systemic approach and support when we're thinking about inclusion or inclusive, that sort of inclusion or inclusive environments. So what is it like to have a child attend an inclusion school? Besides the data that tells us that it's not happening or happening, an inclusion school should really provide a safe environment where questions can be asked and answered, where children are noticed, peers are identifying strength and supporting one another, or believing that they all work on something together, on building compassion for one another. It is a place where differences are normalized and families can be proud of their uniqueness. Exposure to differences and open discussions can have greater acceptance in each other. And families are exposed to supporting collaboratively and supporting their children. So why are we not really giving this opportunity for all our children? That is a question that we need to ask ourselves. Diversity, individual needs, learning community collaborations, and reflective practices should be integrated. And there should be enough resources and support systems to all programs, schools, and educational systems to provide that. It needs to nurture and train teachers who believe and trust that all children can learn and reach their highest potential. It is very important that there is a central belief system in our educational system that values these components. It is all children's right to have a responsive, well-funded, equitable, academic, social, and emotional education and environment. And most importantly, collaborations, when there are fundings being available, when programs are running their own entities, there has to be a way to bring these different entities together so that there's a lot of those support systems are integrated and more effective, that they're valued. They value the common language of what it is to create an inclusive environment. We need to have laws and regulations that require and monitor equitable systems and structures. Research shouldn't be isolated from where practice is. There has to be a way to inform practice so that the research that's being done is not only supporting or informing practice, but it's also informing policies and practices. And most importantly, where are the resources and support systems for financial and human differences, for human support systems are going, and who is accountable to make sure that not any child is left. So it is very important that we're thinking about all these key matters. Most importantly, I want to highlight the importance of the role of teachers and educators in making sure, even when you have the resources, to make sure that children are really given access and services where they need them, so that there is an embedded reflective practice where educators are reflective and modify their attitudes, teaching, and classroom management practices and curricula to meet and accommodate individual needs. Because the misunderstanding or the misalignment of research to practice or funding sources and access to services is not only about providing it, but it's also about who is providing it and how are we preparing the people that are providing it. So the last thing I would like to say in the last minute I have is it is very important that in our efforts, we create a culture and anti-bias approach to diversity and equity in all its sense, identify resources, offer professional development and reflective practice, collaborate, and advocate and impact policies. So there is no excuse for any child to be excluded. We have the responsibility for equitable services and the charge to ensure that all children strive. And this data that just came out and this report that came out really signifies what we are charged for. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah and Allison and Christy, for all of your information, for your recommendations. I hope that that's a great starting space for us to have a few minutes of conversation with those of you that have joined us today. I would invite you to put questions in the chat. And as you are doing that, I would love to just open it up to our panelists to add anything that came to mind as you heard one another talk about your specific areas, brought your voice to the table. Any thoughts or questions that came up for you or you'd like to share right now?
Anna had talked about, the importance of providers, and so critical that we provide the support that they need to include children with disabilities within our office as we collaborate with our colleagues in other offices across the federal government. That is a big focus that we often think about. How can we provide resources to support personnel in including children with disabilities? So within some of the links I put in the chat, there are ones specific to providers, specific to families, and specific to more administrators or state systems. So there's different levels of resources that we offer.
Thank you for sharing those. I know that they're in the link, and they will also go with the after report in the recording. So if you haven't caught those will come your way.
I'll just add quickly that hopefully in the next few months, NIEER will also have a report out on the early childhood special education, early intervention workforce that hopefully we'll be able to share at some point in the near future.
Great. It's good news. We'll be looking for that as well. It'll help us figure out, again, when we're thinking about a moonshot, how can we build that diverse, highly qualified workforce that our little ones deserve. And as you hear about the report and all of the resources that are available, sort of from that perspective of the field, what comes to mind for you?
I think that is really critical. That is very important. So having resources for the field to actually access these resources and be able to train and support the educators in the field is really wonderful. But in light of our discussion, what I just would like to say is that who accesses them? Who accesses these resources? Not that it's not available for all, but who is able to is also another thing that we should, that's the only thing I would add. Like, that's an important aspect of things, because oftentimes there are opportunities or resources, and then, you know, who are the programs that can actually know where they are or even apply for them, or have the resources to do so, those kind of things.
Mhm.
Only thing like I would add to it, so to kind of in light of equity and stuff that we've been talking about.
Right. No, I think that's an important point, and maybe another space for us to ask some questions on the barriers to access for the different information that's out there and support and services that are out there. What are some of those barriers and what are they tied to as well? Allison may already have some of that information or can show us that direction. I think some may be coming up in that workforce report as well that may shine some light on it. We are actually already moving to wrap up. If you have more questions as participants, please join us for the after discussion as we talk more about our key points today really is access. The way to achieve equity is to make sure our children and families have access and belonging. The earlier we start, the better. Really keeping our minds wrapped around the issue of race and gender equity, and that it has been a long-term issue, and what are solutions and how can we enact those solutions in the classroom, in the home programs, et cetera. So thank you so much for being with us today. We've got a couple of closing slides. Our next moonshot, or CAYL's next moonshot, is No Child is Excluded. I think Dr. Washington gave a bit of a preview there, talking about exclusion, suspension, critical topics for us to think through. Next. And we thank you for learning with us today. Lots of ways to connect with CAYL. Again, thank you to our panel today. Thank you to CAYL and Dr. Washington for allowing me to guest host today, and to all of those folks that you see on the screen and bringing this high quality discussion, opportunity for discussion with us. The cue, the link to the next piece is on your, in the chat. So we invite you to come on over and we will continue the discussion. Thank you so much for being here today.